Well, what about the response of the Catholic Church, and what more do Indigenous communities want to hear and see from the Catholic Church? And what about the actions of the Prime Minister and his government in moving forward with reconciliation? Christa Big Canoe is the Legal Director of Aboriginal Legal Services. She joins me now. Thank you for taking time to speak with me today. First of all, let's start there.
Thanks, Peter.
Listen, over the weekend, the Pope expressed sorrow over the discovery of the remains of 215 children in Kamloops, but no apology. What do you think of that failure to apologize?
Well, I think it's a substantial failure, unfortunately, right? I mean, people can feel sorrow for a lot of things, but sometimes we need words. Having said that, you know, something Dr. Cindy Blackstock always says is apology is more than just saying the words. It means not having to repeat it. So an appropriate apology for the actions of those individuals that had care of children and that didn't treat them accordingly should be forthcoming.
And let me pursue that with you. Why is that so important for the Pope to issue that apology?
Well, I think the church has to take responsibility for its role. We have seen in other issues with the Catholic Church, in particular other events and circumstances in other geographical locations, them actually taking the time to apologize for the actions of their clergy. And in this case, we know that there were hard impacts for Indigenous children that have had intergenerational traumatic experiences that the church should just address.
Do you have a sense of why, you know, when we hear this discussion and the church points to the different orders in the church, the oblates and different groups, and that in some cases they've apologized, that the responsibility kind of trickles down, but a lot of people believe the responsibility trickles up and at the very top of the hierarchy. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why there's this reluctance to actually take that next step and have the Pope apologize. Why do you think there's a hesitancy to do that?
I'm not sure why there's a hesitancy, to be honest with you. Like, things centralize back to the Vatican, right? Like it's like almost any other institutional structure. It's a top-down system. So where there's accountability and responsibility, it should come from the top and trickle down. That's true of churches. That's true of governments, right? And you can't hide behind the structures that exist. It's one thing to say, well, one group or the oblates of this diocese has said something, but the reality is it's a top-down process. There has to be oversight and accountability. Otherwise, we could only fear that this will continue to happen to children around the world in different regions if there isn't ownership of the issues.
We're getting conflicting messages, it seems, about records. The Prime Minister has called on the Catholic Church to step up, turn over records. Can you help us understand what records we're talking about and what the challenge has been in obtaining them? Because some members of the Church, including the Archbishop of Toronto on the weekend, said, look, if anybody's holding records, they shouldn't. And as far as we know, records have all been turned over. Help us with that.
Right. Well, I mean, at this point, it almost seems like a blame game. But the reality is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has written an entire volume on this in their final report, right? Volume 4, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. And they made 6 calls to action. One of the first of one, which included receiving as many documents as possible in relation to the unmarked graves, the missing children, or the unknown deaths. So the TRC did a bunch of work on this particular area to identify known names of children that were buried, but that this was one of these big gaps. So whether it's a government or a church pointing at each other, in some cases, there might be legitimate reasons why documents can't be produced, like fires or loss of records. But this back and forth, or sort of the pointing a finger, isn't of assistance. Essentially, there should be a hauling out of information and documents to the best of everyone's ability. The
Prime Minister last week raised the prospect of taking the church to court to get those documents. What do you think of that threat and that approach? Should he?
I'm not sure. The Canadian government lawyers also advise the Prime Minister that he should pursue, First Nation children's right in the First Nation Children's Action at the Human Rights. So right now, Canada has a number of pending cases and litigation against First Nation, including First Nation children and against residential school survivors. So I hope they get some more sound advice before they take action. I think when you threaten things like litigation, it tries to compel people to act. But quite frankly, right now we have a government that's acting in litigation against residential school survivors and Indigenous children. So we should ask our government to be accountable on that too before they start spending a lot of tax dollars money on a litigation when they could be redirecting that money to actually implementing those 6 recommendations or the calls to action that the TRC asked for.
You were also closely involved in the case of an Indigenous woman, Barbara Kentner, killed in 2017 when a man threw a trailer hitch at her from a passing car in Thunder Bay. That man was sentenced today to 8 years in penitentiary. Do you think that that sentence reflects justice and gives a basis for healing?
I believe it does. I mean, some people will find it wasn't harsh enough and some will think it's too harsh, as the judge herself said when she started her decision. The reality is she gave seriousness to the circumstance of his actions. Her decision was well-reasoned and explained the Indigenous community's input through community impact statements. She made it really clear she wasn't able to make a finding of bias based on racism, but that there was a consequence of this horrific action that the Indigenous people, and particularly in Thunder Bay, experience. Unfortunately, in Canada, we haven't seen a lot of accountability when we lose people or there's harm and hurt. So this is a case where we actually can feel like someone is facing consequences of the actions they took that removed a beloved member of our community away from us.
Christa Big Canoe, thanks so much for your time tonight. Great to speak with you.
Thank you, Peter.